end. Then on the right, I found that that was the office of the superintendent of the park, Preston Macy. And right near his was a second office, and that was the office of Fred Overly, who was a park ranger recently from Glacier Park in Montana, but was also serving as acting assistant superintendent. And the third office, right on the end, was where Gordon Gale worked. He was at that time the chief clerk. He had one problem with that title, he had no help. He was the only clerk. Anyway, until I arrived, and so he was very glad to see me. Now he had someone to supervise. And he was a delightful guy to work for. Anyway, I thought that was quite interesting that there were only these three offices and three people in them at that time, 2 months after the park was established. Now, up the street at First and Peabody, there was an old building that K.O. Erickson used to own, and it was leased to the Park Service, and they had one engineer in there, a civil engineer, and an assistant doing some drafting. They were planning for the development, physical development of the park, the buildings and so forth. Jack Cosser had a job as a warehouseman, but he, prior to that time, had doubled in brass doing half a dozen other things. Fire dispatcher, ranger, going out on special calls as ranger, and driving a truck when necessary, and so forth. I'd like to just, in broad brush strokes, tell you about these four main steps leading up to the creation of Olympic National Park, which these fellows are going to talk about. In 1897, President Cleveland established the Olympic Forest Reserve, an area of 1.5 million acres. And this, this took up a lot of the part of the peninsula. That was then operated first by Interior, but later on by the Forest Service, and became a national forest. In 1904, Senator Cushman from Tacoma, United States Senator, introduced a bill to create Elk National Park. Well, that just didn't fly. There was so much opposition from the timber industry and perhaps others that the thing was dead shortly, and it wasn't ever revived until many years later with a different approach, different name. In 1909, President Teddy Roosevelt, with the strong help of his good friend Gifford Pinchot, was governor of Pennsylvania and also a keen forester, and later became first head of the Forest Service, created the Mount Olympus National Monument. And that was first, it was first under the Forest Service and then later put under Interior. Anyway, in 1993, President Roosevelt saw fit to move that from Forest Service over to the management by Interior. And the Park Service assigned the responsibility then for this Mount Olympus National Monument, the management of it, to the Superintendent Tomlinson at Rainier. Well, Mr. Tomlinson, Major Tomlinson, as they call him, picked out one of his people he had seen as a comer. It was his assistant chief ranger, a fellow by the name of Preston Macy, who was in his early 40s at that time, or middle 40s. He gave him the title of acting custodian of Mount Olympus National Monument. And it was a matter of really commuting over from Mount Rainier for a few days or a few weeks and back. And during that time, he brought Chris Morgenroth in to help him some, a couple of other people. But 1936, he actually moved over here with his family, and the headquarters for that monument were the attic of the house that the Macy's had up on East 12th Street. And they managed to squeeze 3 people into the attic I don't know where Fred Overly went, but it was Mr. Macy, Gordon Gale, and Jack Hosser. Then, after with that background and those steps coming closer and closer to the park, and as you know, on June 29, 1938, President Roosevelt did sign the document creating Olympic National Park. Now I'd like to, at this point, begin to introduce I will introduce each of the three speakers in turn. The first speaker this evening is Floyd Dickinson. His name I think is familiar to many of you old-timers who spent some time in the back country. Floyd grew up here on the peninsula, born and raised down in Hoodsport, went to school, graduated from the University of Washington, where he studied forestry, and his family ran a resort down at Staircase on the Upper Skokomish, on the Skokomish River, and his dad also did some packing. So Floyd began to get the flavor of backcountry very early. He'd go with his dad in his packing trips and work with him. He'd see the rangers out there and got really interested in this type of work. In 1938, he became the second ranger hired by the Park Service. He'd been serving as a temporary ranger, seasonal ranger, on the monument, working for Mr. Macy. And then he became one of the first rangers there when the park was established. I use my words very carefully, not lightly, when I say that when you see this man, Floyd Dickinson, standing here tonight, you're looking at a legend in the Olympics. I've talked with more people, and so have my other ranger friends, and we hear this feedback from people in the back country that they speak in the voice of awe about Floyd. In fact, these rangers themselves do. I have the joy of playing in a 7-hand poker game here, and we've done it for about 15 years, penny ante poker, and I'm the only one who's not a career ranger. But the only reason I got in, I guess, at the end of my first 9 months in the park there, Mr. Macy asked me if I'd like to be a seasonal ranger. Oh yes. So I did that until I finished graduate school 3 years later, worked each summer. Anyway, we have this poker group, and we also go out every year for a couple times up the Hoh or Elwha usually, and clear these blow-down trees off the trail for the park. And these other guys and I all agree that Floyd is just naturally our leader. He's the dean. And we all agree that he can do any ranger task and do it superbly, whether it's fighting fires or mapping or handling horses and pack horses, planting fish, anything. Floyd knows it all. And we have the feeling, all of us that work with Floyd and around him, that he has a special instinct for this kind of work and for living and surviving in the back country under difficult conditions. And everything he does so well. At age 83, he's still taking horses and saddle horse and pack horses into the back country. You don't see that too many people. The subject of all three of these speakers tonight is the work of the early park rangers, and Mary is talking about her own experiences working here during the war. So it's my great pleasure now to call on Floyd as the first speaker. Floyd Dickinson.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Well, most of my remarks are going to be a little incidents that happened during my stay or work in the park here. Some of them are amusing, some of them are just occasions. And my first 4 seasons as a seasonal ranger, I worked for the park in the southeast corner. And they assigned to me the Dosey Wallops, Quinault, Skokomish, and Duckabush River. And beautiful country, and I enjoyed 4 seasons of it down there. And I was going to school at the time and going to College of Forestry at the UW. So it took me quite a few years to go to college during the Depression. I was 7 years going through college, but it was worth it. I got a permanent assignment to the park through civil service as a district ranger. And my first station was at Claylock, and I was at Claylock for 9 years. And this was in 42 when the war was just begun. And we had our problems with gas rationing and grocery rationing and blackouts and so forth. And the War Department had different ideas for what the park was established for. And they wanted aircraft warning stations. And they wanted 13 warning stations on strategic points within the park. And these stations were to be manned 24 hours a day, and manpower was a real problem during the war. If you were able to walk, well, you were a soldier, and if you weren't able to walk, well, it took you into a war industry. So most of our observers that we had were elderly people, probably in their 70s, and their duties were to man these stations 24 hours a day, and there was 2 of them there, and each one of them was on 7 days a week and 12 hours a day. And Mary Johnson here, she was one of them at that time. And anyway, it was difficult to find people to take those spots. In my Claylock district, I had 5 of these stations. One of them was at Enchanted Valley on East Fork Quinault. One was at the divide between the Elwha and the North Fork Quinault at Low Divide, Klutzman Rock on the Queets, Geonetic Hill on the Bogoshiel, and Warcombe Hill on the divide between the Clawha and the Bogoshiel. Now, these stations, these 5 I had, were anywhere from 6 to 16 miles from the closest road. So when people got in there, and they were there for a while. And during that period, like in 42, tourists were not a problem in the park. Like at the Hole, as I recall, we had, maybe we'd have 1 or 2 cars a week. And nowadays they have maybe several hundred per week. But those 1 or 2 cars were usually people that had found out how to beat the gas rationing. So they were traveling around. And on one of these, well, the Army was, was always calling up and they wanted to send an inspector with me when I was going into these stations. And on one occasion, this fella called up from Fort Lewis, and his name was Robert. And he wanted to go into Chan Valley with me. And I told him, fine. I thought I'd be going up, starting up the next day. So I said, I'm going to stay all night at Graves Creek Ranger Station. And there's 2 feet of snow there. And you can drive within about three miles down the road. But you can't drive all the way at the station because of so much snow. And he says, well, I've got a 4-wheel, 4x4 Army rig. And he says, I can drive up to the station if there's 2 feet of snow. And I said, okay. So well, I was up at the ranger station then, and about dark, here he came walking in. He parked down the road 3 miles. He didn't make it. When you get to pushing snow with a car, well, you're just about done. That's about it. Anyway, Robert and I started out the next day for Chan Valley. We had 13 miles to go, all on snowshoes. And at daylight, we'd gone 2 miles, and he was pretty tired. And as we kept going, well, when we come to creeks, we take off our snowshoes, wade across, put them on again. And he got to drinking that ice water, and that ice water didn't help him any. The fact that he was pretty tired starting. We got up to within 2 miles of Chan Valley by dark time, and we still had 2 miles to go. And the observer in Chan Valley, he'd snowshoed down the trail 2 miles with a gas lantern and took us on in. But this Robert, we'd hesitate or something like that, but he'd go and flop out in the snow, and then we'd have to get him up again. There was no place to stay out there in the snow. Anyway, the next morning we had 11 inches of new snow, and it was snowing hard. And I told him, well, we'll stay over a day and maybe you'll rest up and the weather might get better. And he thought it over a few minutes, and then he got panicky. He said, I gotta get out of here. I just gotta get out of here. So 8 o'clock in the morning while we started down the trail. And at 4 o'clock, we'd only gone 6 miles. And that was in 8 hours. For not very good time. Anyway, there was a shelter which I had stocked with wood and one sleeping bag and some food down there 6 miles. So we stopped there, and I got a fire going, got the sleeping bag out, and got some food started. And he stayed there all night, and I walked on down to Graves Creek Ranger Station, stayed all night, and then the next morning I snowshoed back up, got him out of the shelter, and we made it out to the car without any more occasion. On our way up that day, I noticed out to the side towards the river, there was a big cedar tree. Oh, it's 5 or 6 feet through, and it had limbs clear down to within 8 or 10 feet of the ground. So it kind of was like you might say, a barn. There was no snow next to the trunk of the tree. It was all dirt. And I looked over there, and here was an elk over there. So I went over and snowshoed up about 30 feet from it. And it stomped his feet and clicked his teeth at me, and he just telling me that that's far enough. And I took the hint, left. Next morning, coming down, I looked over there, and in fact, I walked over, see if she was still there, and she was still there, but she was dead. And so I looked her over pretty close, and she was thin, and she had a lot of ticks and lice on her. And I finally concluded that that was what killed her, was the ticks and the lice. And these stations, these 6 stations, I tried to service them every 2 weeks. It kept me going. Because like going to Chan Valley and back was 2 days. Going to Low Divide was 2 days going in and 1 day coming out, snowshoeing. And when I would go in, I would take pack sack, of course, and take all our letters and mail. Of course, their mail, there was no junk mail then, or I never packed it all. But and then some fresh vegetables and some fresh meat. I'd hold them over for a couple of weeks and I'd be back again. And another occasion, this is at Chan Valley also, the name of the observers was Kemp, K-A-M-P-F. And of course, in the fall, it took us about 3 weeks to get somebody in there with the horses, a couple horses, and build a sled and get the wood enough to last 6 to 8 months until about the 1st of April before they could get out. They grew in about the 1st of November. And then in late October, November, I got a pack street in there to pack food enough in for them. So they'd have food all winter except for what I bring on my inspections. Well, Mrs. Kemp let us know when they were anxious to come out. Of course, I guess anyone would be if they're in there for 6 months and couldn't get out of that one place. But 1st of April, I had it scheduled for her to come out. And she let it be known that she was too sickly to come out. She couldn't make it. She'd have to be packed out on a stretcher. So when we went in on the 1st of April, I was prepared. I had 3 other men and myself. That was 4 of us. And I took Igor Olson with a pack string. I think he had 5 horses, pack and saddle horses. And we were going to bring her out on a stretcher. Well, after supper, Igor and I, we got sitting around there talking about what we were going to do the next day and how we were going to do it. And we figured we'd get a couple long poles and get a blanket on them and have it so the poles would be far enough apart so we could walk in between, and then one man in front and one behind, and 2 waiting their turn for a 15-20 minute break, and then they would get in there. Mrs. Kemp, she sat there and took it all in. Never said a word, not a word. Anyway, we also brought up that we could put one end of the stretcher on the pack horse, one on each side of the pack horse. And then just one man would have to carry the other end. And then we got to discussing the pros and cons. What about when we get to switchback? Or what do we get to bees nest? All these things, Mrs. Kemp, she kept listening and sitting there and listening, and she must have digested a lot of it, because the next morning she went out and got on a saddle horse and rode all the way out. Now, another time, up the Hole, up at Hole, or Blue Glacier. That's 18 miles up from the end of the Hole Road. And there was Bud Hannafy and somebody else. There were 3 of us. And we'd come up the day before. And then that day we'd climb Mount Olympus, and the next day we were going to hike out. Well, along about a little after supper, sitting there, and here come a bear. And she had 2 cubs with her. Well, she was more interested in food than anything else. She was sniffing around as close as she could get to the camp. And the 2 cubs were rolling and playing, and they finally ran up a tree down there about 30, 40 feet. And they were up about 10 feet, and then they just stood there and looked around. I said to Bud, I said, watch me, I'll put those 2 cubs way up that tree. And I ran down there and I clamped my hands around the tree and I hollered, and it scared the devil out of them, because up they went and they just peed all over me. Well, rangers in those days, that was 30s and 40s, early 50s, were as different from rangers today as night and day. A ranger in those early days was a pretty practical man. He was someone that had to pack horses or shoe a horse, do trail maintenance or telephone maintenance. We weren't bothered much with the tourists because there weren't too many then. But today, well, you've got a little different setup with your rangers. This is my observation. They're more tourist oriented, and they are quite a lot law oriented. And then they even carry a revolver on their hip when they're out on patrol. And I thank you.
One of the things we enjoyed doing, sitting around in this poker game I told you about, is swapping stories like that. They just come up night after night. It's a very loose game, and we get in a lot of good storytelling. Our second speaker this evening will be Jack Nettinger, who also spent a career in the Park Service here. Jack was born and raised here in Port Angeles. His father and uncle operated a hardware store business. We used to see the store there until recent years, just this side of the south of the Seafirst Bank, where it is now. And so he grew up absorbing, I guess, partly by osmosis, the Olympic country too, like Floyd did. And I think that much that I've said about Floyd and his instincts for the backcountry and his great ability to get around in it, reminding some people, they said, of Chris Morgenroth and the way he seemed to be that kind of a person. I think you can honestly say, to a substantial degree, applies also to Jack Nettinger and to Ted Sullivan. they're very impressive men out in the backcountry. And like Floyd, they both have done their university studies. Jack rose from being a trail crew worker to being in charge of all trail crew activity in the whole park. Then he switched over and became he was a seasonal ranger. Then he became a permanent ranger, and then he was promoted from there, substantial promotion to park forester. Talking about promotions, one of the things I had on my notes to say about Floyd, and I didn't do it, I'll just make a parenthetical insert here, is that the Park Service, not only here at Olympic, but back in Washington, recognized Floyd's outstanding capabilities, and he was honored by being promoted from park ranger and forester here to chief assistant forester for the Pacific Northwest region, which was at that time in San Francisco and covered, I don't know, half a dozen or so states. When we're out with Jack Nattinger, we all, the rest of us agree that Jack is still a hard man at his present age, is still a hard man to keep up with on the trail. He's always had a reputation for really being a great walker. And all three of these people, I think maybe particularly Ted and Jack, have a consummate skill using a chainsaw and removing these 6 to 8 foot diameter blowdowns across the trail, these trees that blow down during the winter storms, and then our public group comes in there on a volunteer basis and clears them out. It's really something to watch these guys do it. You know, a chainsaw you start cutting, and when it begins to get cut in a certain distance, it can bind, and if you do an undercut, the tree can fall out if you're not careful. And these fellows know just how to handle all of this stuff, make the side cuts and keep the thing from dropping on their saw, many other aspects of it that show very great skill. Many times when I've been backpacking in the backcountry, and my wife Carolyn was here tonight with me on those trips, I might mention Jack in some way, or they mention him, and just like with Floyd, they speak in voice of awe about this fellow that they've known and maybe and heard about or worked with through the years. It's my pleasure now to call on Jack Nattinger.
Thank you all for those kind words. You know, for a guy who has trouble figuring out which day it is when he gets out of bed in the morning, driving back 60 years sometimes made a little problem. But really, it wasn't any problem because we had so much fun in those days. I always figured that the years in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s were the golden years of Olympic National Park for two reasons. One reason was that we had a lot of freedom as district rangers to do what we thought had to be done in our area. And we didn't have too much coming down from up above. And the second one was we enjoyed the work. We enjoyed the packing and the hiking and working on the trail and the telephone lines. And forgot to tell you that Floyd is typical of the fellows that worked for the park in those days. When they promoted him from the Olympic National Park to San Francisco, didn't take him long to figure out that was not the place. They're looking for the place. He quit the park and came back here as a consulting forester. Yeah. Well, I went to work for the park in 1938. It was still a monument by a couple of weeks, and in June. And first worked down in the hole with the trail crew. And then I went on the Sawlook and another trail crew later on in the summer. It was run by Chris Morgenroth. Well, I don't know if a lot of you know the history of Chris Morgenroth, but he was here in the early days of the Forest Service. He worked for the Forest Service for 20 to 30 years. And so he was in on the development of the trail system, which covered about 600 miles of trail in the existing park now. And miles and miles and miles of phone line. I don't know how many miles it were. But this was all there when when the national park was created. And so it's a matter of maintaining what the Forest Service had done in the first place. But after, in the fall of '38, I went up to Humes Ranch, and at that time the Park Service was in the trail building business. And they were constructing a trail from Humes Ranch, about 2.5 miles up the Elwha. And it was supposed to go up Long Ridge, to Dodger, and out Loving Peak, and around by the Bay Range, and come out to Salt Lake. They had a crew over in the Salt Lake side of the trail, and they had this crew down at Humes Ranch. And part of the crew was a bridge crew, and they were building a log bridge across the mouth of the Grand Canyon of the Elwha. And they built that log bridge right into solid rock. It was just a rock cliff on the other side. And they had a couple of good powder monkeys, Tony Jacobson and Albert Anderson. And they drilled and blew that rock out of there so that they could put the log bridge right across it. The rest of us, we went down across the foot log that had been put down. And then we went up with Matic and a shovel and we started digging out trail. And they had a skinny cook at that camp. There was about 15 or 20 men. And they had a real skinny cook. And his name was Clint McCourt. And Clint was a boy, I never ate so much good food in all my life. And he had a long table, about as long as this platform up here, hand hewn out, you know, from the materials there. And Clint would load that down with, well, I think he was a logging camp cook before that, so you can imagine how that table would load it down. But Clint would stand there and he'd fill up so much that you could hardly get up from your seat. And by the time you left, well, he'd just laugh and he'd say, "What's the matter? Aren't you guys hungry?" I said, "No, we're hard enough." So he had a little one disaster though. There was the eating tent, and then just a little space, and then there was the cook tent. Well, they always mixed up their batter for the hot cakes and for the pies and so on the night before. One night skunk got in the cook tent. Before they could get the skunk out, well, you can imagine what happened. So next morning here we were starting to eat pancakes and they just didn't smell good. It tasted a little funny. And Clint said, "You're going to eat all this dough before you get any good stuff." So he said, "Go at it." So we had, for a couple of days, we had skunk cakes and pancakes and when we had the flood this year, I can remember it. I remember we used to have in those, I don't know just how long it happened, but every winter you'd get a snow in the high country and then you'd get a Chinook wind, you could feel that warm wind come in, and the flood would carry on here. I remember we went out, we worked all winter on that trail, and in December and January we went out for Christmas and New Year's, and when we came back after New Year's, we could only drive to the concrete bridge on 101 across the Elwha River. And then they had some rowboats because Little River had flooded into the Elwha, and so that road was all closed off. So they rowed us up to where they got on the road again. And the CCCs from the camp at Elwha, they drove down and picked us up. Took us up to Whiskey Bend, and we went back up and were able to work on the job. Floyd told you more about the air warning stations in the 40s. And when I came back in 43, Eddie Nyholm was the district ranger at Elwha. And so I ended up working with Eddie. And the nice part of that job, you either packed with horses, or you had a snowshoe, or you had to ski or hike or whatever. But you always carried your tools, your axe, and your even telephone tools in case you had to repair any telephone line on the way. They had a backup in most stations of radios, but they had the double system. He phoned, the phone didn't work well, maybe the radio would work, maybe it wouldn't, I don't know. But they had a station up at Elkhorn, and it always amazed me that they'd bring these people down into a valley like the Elwha, and right next to the Elwha River, and expect them to hear Japanese planes flying over up above the mountain there. But anyway, they spent the winter there at Elkhorn. We packed about everything you could think of. Packed coal to Pyramid Peak, and we packed propane tanks up to Bowshill Peak in the summer. And we packed a bed up to Elkhorn. But one thing we didn't pack was live chickens. When Eddie was there, we were packing up to go to Elkhorn and Whiskey Bend. And the people wanted a chicken. I guess they wanted to have fresh eggs, what the idea was. He had them in a box and covered with a black cloth, and the Sage was the white horse that we had, a real calm horse. So we thought, well, put it on Sage. So put it on Sage, put the tarp over, and have the diamond, so the box was right in the middle. Just about that time, something like that, I don't know if that or a rooster, but that horse, I'll tell you what, straight up in the air, down the road he went, a quarter of a mile. He had packs and food and tea, everything all over the place. Well, they ended up in a hurry. Eddie got his axe, cut the head off, so they had chicken stew, I guess. And then in the 50s, I was a trail foreman for the park. And of course, Floyd and Dewey Webster was on the east side of the park. And we worked alone a lot. You were packing, or you were, whatever you were doing, or servicing the stations while you were alone a lot. So, at one time when I was going up the Elwha, I had a pack string to go to Elkhorn. And after you, about 2 miles up the Elwha Trail, and then you run into a sharp incline, about a half a mile trail. And I got about halfway up that, I had about 4 horses, pack horses behind me. And I heard this cracking sound, and things were kind of, I knew what it was, but I didn't know where it was. And gee, all of a sudden, this big old snag comes down about 100 feet behind the tail horse. And I don't know who got up there first, but I think we all made it at the same time up the top of the hill. And the horse being at the far end, he was up with me by the time we got up there. Well, in those days, you carried, like I say, you carried your tools, you got your axe out. We used a cruiser axe, double-bitted axe with a short handle, back down to where the log came across. I think it was about 3 inches. You chop it out, free the phone line, back to the horses, and put your axe on the horse, and away you go again. And I did have one thing in the Olympic National Park named after me. Up about 22 miles up the Elwha, I had a string of horses, and I was carrying cement. Near Bucking Horse Creek, and just above Bucking Horse Creek, the trail crossed on a bridge with a pier in the middle, across the Elwha River, main Elwha River. And it was a hot August day, and I was, like my wife said, every time I get in to steer anything, when I fall asleep anyway, I was falling asleep on the horse. And so I had the lead rope, and we came to this clay slide before we got to Bucking Horse Creek. And there's a ravine that went down to the Elwha River. And I was dozing, and I guess the horse was dozing too. Because there was a puncheon bridge about 15 feet that we had to cross, and you got about halfway across, and you just stepped right off. Over he went. I got my right foot out of the stirrup. I didn't get my left foot out in time to get back on the puncheon. So we ended up, the horse went back, going down the hill, slide about 30 feet down to the river bottom. And I was right in the middle on his belly, and all these 4 feet were going around. I was holding my head, wondering if I was going to make it or not. Got down to the bottom, horse just laid there, and I thought, oh my God, you got a dead horse, so what do I do? But I got up and took the reins and he just jumped up and away he went. We walked up back up to where we get up the trail and back, and the pack horses just stopped right there, and that's where they were. Stayed right there. Went on there again. But later on, I told the story to E.O. Michaels. They usually call him Cougar Mike. And he was, and Mike was a packer, and he had cougar dogs, and he used to hunt in the Olympics, hunt cougar an awful lot. Well, anyway, Mike was up there one time at the same place. He put up this, he scratched out this sign, stuck it there on the slide, and it says, "Handsome Jack Slide." Well, I don't know what is handsome, I have more hair. But the thing was that the horse that went down was named Handsome. The horse was Handsome and I was Jackson. And one of the things that always bothered me in all the trips I made in the hills and on the trail, never saw a cougar. And the only time I ever saw a cougar in the wild was Will and Ted and Floyd up the hole a few years ago, and I guess we ran onto one. But I saw lots of bobcat. I don't know why, but I used to see bobcat drop off the trail in front of me, and go up the trail, and I'd always try to get up behind it, but I never could make it, except for one time. I was going up the North Fork of the Quinault, and up to Kempta Creek. Well, I got to Kempta Creek, and when you get to Kempta Creek, the trail comes up the North Fork of the Quinault and makes a hard right to hard left. It goes up Kempta Creek, and then there's a high bridge that goes across Kempta Creek and switchbacks up the hill. And as I turn that corner to go up Kempta Creek, there's a bobcat that came down off the hill, off the slope there, dropped on the trail, shot up and hard to cross the bridge. I thought that was my chance. So I tiptoed up across the bridge, go right behind the bobcat. And I let out a real whoop. And I don't know to this day what I'd done. That thing had turned around and come the other way. But that cat just took off the deck, and when he hit the deck, well, all 4 feet were going, and up the hill he went. Well, I thought that was the end of the bobcat, but I was wrong. Pretty soon I looked at the hill, and there was a stump up there where they cut one of the strings off for the bridge. And all of a sudden I saw, the curiosity of a cat. Here's a little head up there with a few ears sticking up. Looking down and saying, "What all that commotion down there?" Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. The third early ranger speaker will be Ted Sullivan. When our poker group goes up the river and does this clearing work, we sit around and talk in the evening and so forth. And one of those evening chats, sitting around before dinner, listening, smelling the fragrance of Floyd's cooking. Incidentally, he's an outstanding camp cook. We decided that Ted, being by far the youngest of us, would be nicknamed the Kid, and he's been known as that ever since. One time I asked Ted, "Well, how do you feel about this, having that honor named the Kid?" He said, "Well, it is a great honor for me, all right?" And he said, "Especially, they always let me carry this heavy chainsaw." Ted is also a local product. He was born and raised here in the Port Angeles area. His grandfather was a chief county engineer, and his father was an engineer, civil engineer for the county. Ted, of course, attended schools here. I've talked with some of his classmates, and one of them particularly told me what a very fine football player Ted was in those days. And he also loved the Olympic country from the time he was a little kid. He just began to get a strong feeling for it. And he told me that the first job he had working for the Park Service was when he was 14 years old. He somehow persuaded the people over there at Mount Rainier National Park, who had a blister rush program going, to hire him. And 14, youngest Park Service man I know. And then his first job actually working for Olympic National Park was at the Elwha station, and he told me that Jack Nattinger was his boss. But Ted did, like the rest of us, work his way through college, and he'd go to school and come back and work on trail crews in the summertime when he was during those college years, and do other jobs like that for the park. And then he eventually got appointment as a permanent ranger. First a seasonal ranger, a temporary ranger, then a permanent ranger. And during his ranger years, he was assigned to, not for different places in the Olympic, and also to Glacier Bay in Alaska, and to Colorado. And recognizing his superb capabilities, the Park Service, near the end of his career, made him superintendent of El Morro National Monument in New Mexico. It's a real pleasure for me to call on the kid to come up here and tell you some stories. Ted Sullivan.
Thanks, Will. You said about everything I was going to say. I started working for a three-man trail crew in the winter of 1946. And Bobby Locke was the foreman. Marvin Dace and I were the two kids on the crew. And they had us working up the Elwha. Along about November, we got clear up the Hayes River, which is 17 miles from the end of the road. Woke up one morning and it was just deathly quiet. Couldn't hear anything. We looked out the window and there was about 6 inches of snow. So Bobby says, we better get out of here. So he, in those days we had a phone line up that far. And he got on the phone and he called down to Jack Broadbent, who was ranger at the time. Jack says, well, that's nothing new. We've got about the same down here. So he says, I'll be up to get you tomorrow with the pack horses. And sure enough, about an hour after dark, here he came. He not only went 17 miles up the trail, he had to go 3 miles from the station because he couldn't drive the horse truck up the road. So here he came, and I was real impressed the way he took care of the horses. And by the way, he didn't ride. He always said the horses didn't go fast enough for him. He walked. But that was the first thing he did was put blankets on the horses, give them a good feed of oats. Next morning out we went down to the Elwha. Well, we got down to the Elwha and somebody, experts, said, well, there's too much snow. There was a crew up the Elwha. We'll send them down to Floyd and Dickinson, work on the wheats the rest of the winter. So we got down there and whoever decided there was no snow for wheats was wrong because we had lots of snow. We worked around on the phone line, brushed the phone line, and built the little 3-mile nature trail at the end of the road. And then as the weather got better, we went on up the Wheats Trail. Well, as you know, to get on the trail, you have to ford the river at the end of the road. And Floyd would pack us in, and about every 3 or 4 weeks, here he'd come with a pack horse load of food for us. And we were clear up at Bob Creek Shelter. This was about March. Boy, we were getting low on food, and Marv and I were really looking at the chipmunks and the squirrels eating there. Well, one day, here comes Floyd riding in. No pack horse, but he had a nice big steelhead hanging from the saddle horn, his right horse. And we said, gee, that's awful nice, Floyd, but where's the food? Well, this is it, he said. What more do you want? Well, we're leaving, Mark, I said. We started down the trail. Here he had the pack horse tied up to a tree. In later years, we Will said we go up and open the whole trail in the spring. And Jack, being the old trail boss, I have a little story to tell about him. We'd go for 3 days. We'd go in the first day and open the trail 9 miles into Olympus. Second day, we'd go on up towards Elk Lake and work on that. And then come out the third day. So we were on our second day and had gone up towards Elk Lake. And Jack always liked to take off ahead of us with his axe. He did the axe work. We brought the chainsaw and did the chainsaw work. Well, we were working away and we finally got up as far as the high bridge. And here in the middle of the trail was a stick with a note on it. And it said, "Cut this pack bone." That's all it said. No please, no nothing. So I got out at the end, I said, "Please, cut this pack number. Besides, we didn't get up this far." But we all love the work. And the park lets us stay in the guard stations. And it's works fine. And we're going up again this year. You've now heard the stories from our 3 early park rangers, and I'm pleased to next call on Mary Johnson to speak. As I mentioned, Mary did work here with her husband during World War II for the Park Service and this fire warning and barrage balloon early warning system. They stayed with that all through the war and then left afterward. But and also Mary said that she came here when she was about ready to start her freshman year in high school, so she went all through high school here, and she married a fellow who was Lee Johnson, who was 1 year ahead of her in school. But since the end of the war, she and her husband kept going into the back country for many years, and while her husband passed away a few years ago, Mary is still doing that, and she's looking forward to making a trip into the back country this year. It's a real pleasure to call on Mary. She said that she prefers not to just speak as these men have, telling stories, but she's prepared a paper which she's going to read to you. It's very interesting. Mary Johnson.
I'd hate to stretch up to that.
How's that? Which way time is this?
Back the other way.
Pardon? This way. Okay, it's not a tightening. Oh, there's his eye.
Can you hear me? Yes. Well, as he said, in 1929, I moved from Brainerd, Minnesota, here to Fort Angeles with my parents. Can everyone hear me? I was with my parents, my brother, and a sister. And I started high school that fall and met Leith Johnson on the school bus. We rode the school bus from Dry Creek And then we graduated from high school in 32 and 33. We were married in 36. Leith had been Eagle Scout, and as I understand it, he and Jack Mattinger became Eagle Scouts the same time. He'd hiked a lot through those years, so then he took me to Lake Angeles, Hurricane Ridge, Enchanted Valley, Low Divide, along the Elwha River to Crouse Bottom, Elkhorn, Humes Ranch, and many other places. Then we also skied at Deer Park from 1937 to 1940. The road to Deer Park was very narrow, and the cars were only allowed to go up until 2 o'clock. None could go down until after 3 o'clock. And there was one hill that nearly all the cars needed some extra weight on the back bumper in order to get over the top. The fellows from the cars behind would all walk up there and help the cars one by one. Then those people would get in their cars and each one go on. In 1940, we leased East Beach Resort on Lake Crescent, but we only had a short stay because of World War II. That spring, the county removed the old ferry dock. Work was scarce, so we went to Seattle and then to San Jose, California. In the spring of '43, we learned from the park superintendent in San Francisco that Olympic National Park was looking for people to serve as aircraft warning observers in the lookouts. Well, we sent a night letter to Preston Macy. We were homesick, and that sounded so good to us. He said, "Get here as fast as you can." Boy, we did, and we were hired in April as relief observers. This was especially appealing to us, since we knew from that we would spend from 10 days to 2 weeks at each place. Leith first went to Pyramid Peak with Claude Johnson. Then the park hired me, and we went to Staircase, Hurricane Ridge, Deer Park, and Elkhorn. Then we were assigned to Dodger Point for 4 months, and to Eagle Ranger Station on the Soda River from November '43 to the end of May '44. One of the difficult places to get to was Hurricane Ridge. Herb and Lois Crystal were there, and there was so much snow, the roads and trails couldn't be seen. Mr. Chrysler made his way down along Hell's Canyon to Whiskey Bend, and he marked it with orange papers. Some of you don't know about that, but in those days they wrapped oranges in orange tissue paper. Well, that's what he used. Eddie Nyholm, district ranger, had been assigned to go with us, and the 3 of us followed Herb's trail through the snow. I don't know how far it was, but I know it was steep. Lois had asked me to bring a permanent wave kit and do her hair before she went. She'd been in there all winter, and she didn't want anybody to see her until she had her hair done. So I gave her a permanent before she and Eddie went out that same day. Only at one of the lookouts did we find people with cabin fever. When we got to Elkhorn on the Elwha River, E.A. Kitchen and Mr. Wilson, they'd been there all winter, and they weren't speaking. They'd say to us, you tell him. They'd say, you tell him this. But they wouldn't speak to each other. They had a chalk mark down the middle of the cabin to divide their quarters. Well, for each lookout, we carried our 2-week supply of groceries. But on this 12-mile trip into Elkhorn, the park gave us a pack horse, and then they gave us one to take turns riding. So we would walk a while, then ride a while. When we went to Dodger Point on June 28th, our packing party consisted of Chief Ranger Bill Augustine, District Ranger Eddie Nyholm, Claude Johnson, 4 park horses, and Oscar Nelson with 5 pack horses. Sergeant Matthews of the 4th Fighter Command also went along. Again, Leith and I were given a horse to take turns riding. And I like that because you get tired riding a horse and then you get tired of walking, so it's nice to change up. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, we had reached the 11-mile line, and the snow was so deep and soft that one of the horses slipped and threw a pack. They decided we should camp overnight, hoping that by morning the snow would have hardened. Well, it did, but after going about another 1.5 miles, the same lead horse, which was one of Mr. Nelson's, bumped the pack box against the icy hillside, and it threw him off balance. He rolled side over side down the steep hillside for about 200 feet. Groceries and everything going with him. Well, Mr. Nelson brought him back up. He wasn't injured, but very shaken. Mr. Nelson unpacked all of his horses because he thought it was just too dangerous. The park people kept trying to get their horses, but it was impossible. So each took a backpack, and then they cached the rest of it under trees. Leith and I went ahead of the rest, but had to guess how to get there because of the deep snow. Couldn't see trails. The others left that day. Well, there was snow right up to the doorstep of the lookout. And all the rest of them left that day, and it took Leith a month of day trips to retrieve the rest of our supplies. Our most challenging task up there was to get enough wood close enough for us to drag it or carry it. The snow had to be melted for water, and the tiny stove was only about 18 inches square. We kept a kettle of snow on there all the time. We literally wore out the water. It was so precious. We'd take a bath, then we'd wash clothes in the water, then we'd mop the floor with what was left. It soaked it all up. The firewall between the firebox and the oven had burned through, so the ashes went in everything we baked. The oven only held one small loaf of bread at a time, and the fire had to be extinguished after each loaf and the ashes emptied before we could start again for another loaf. The mosquitoes, too, were so thick, Leith had to do his wood cutting at night. And when either of us went out to spot a plane, we had to even cover our heads as much as possible. The one inside would kill mosquitoes as fast as we could after each door opened. We had no screens, no repellents. They'd be like a black cloud when you open the door. And as someone else mentioned, we were on watch 24 hours. So we chose 6-hour shifts for sleeping. In October, we went to Eagle Ranger Station on the Soda River. This was sheer luxury with modern conveniences in contrast with the rigors of Dodger. Oh, and I should tell you that while we were at Dodger, the park kept extending our time. We were supposed to come out 1 month, and then they'd say, well, the weather's still good, so stay another month. And they didn't bring us many supplies these last 2 months. And Herb Chrysler raised a big garden, so one day he surprised us, and it was in August, and we were so thrilled with the big pack of vegetables that he brought. Fresh corn, lettuce, tomatoes, even watermelon. It was wonderful. In the spring of '44, there was no more need for aircraft observers, but we liked the lookouts, so we hired on as fire watchers at Deer Park. We stayed there all the summer. Then we settled down and had a son and daughter, and then we adopted our only grandson. Leith worked as custodian of the Franklin Grade School for 30 years and passed on at 73 in 1987. We had 51 years. We took our children on many hikes and taught them to water ski on Lake Crescent. After Leith was gone, my daughter thought I needed a new hobby, so she gave me cross-country ski equipment, which I have enjoyed. I also became acquainted with a new hiking companion, Jean Bailey. In 1993, I decided I wanted to celebrate a 50-year reunion with all of the lookouts we had lived in, 7. So Jean and I went to all of them. We didn't take any horses this time. We hiked all the way. Last year, we made our second hike in Enchanted Valley. And this year, she wants to go to Seven Lakes Basin. So it looks like I might make my 5th trip into Seven Lakes. Park Service personnel were wonderful to work with. And when Jean and I went to Dodger, we had the greatest cooperation and help from the district rangers at the Elwha, Dan and Dee Renee.
Thank you, Mary, for that fine presentation. Maybe we ought to think about trying to recruit Mary for work. Well, that ends the formal presentations tonight. And Kathy, if there's still time, why I know these early rangers and Mary would be very happy to try to answer any questions that people might have.
You're all here, and there's still time. The folks will be moving back towards the table where they have a bunch of the stuff they used to work with, a whole bunch of pictures that are of interest to folks. At the same time, we'll be set up over on the side. If anyone wants to find out anything about the Olympic Discovery Trail, we'll be glad to answer your questions and talk with you. Also about the Peninsula Trails Coalition. We'll do a swap here, maybe 20 minutes, something like that. Go ahead and talk with the folks. And in the meantime, Mr. Hoff will be setting up his slide projector for his program that will start here shortly on the construction of the Spruce Railroad. So stretch your legs,